This is Ann O'Brien from AnnO'BrienLiving.com.
I am here with Michaela Boehm, and we're going to be speaking today about empowered sexuality. I am thrilled to have Michaela on. I first met Michaela in 2009, and I've been impressed with her work ever since. Haven't seen her much because I had a 3-year-old, but that's another story. So I am so excited to reconnect with you, Michaela.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a while, but
So I'll read y'all Michaela's bio, and then we're going to ask her some questions and hear some of the gems she has to offer today. So Michaela Boehm teaches and counsels internationally as an expert in intimacy and sexuality. Born and raised in Austria, Michaela combines her background in psychology and extensive clinical experience with her in-depth training in the yogic arts as a classical Kashmiri tantric lineage holder into a unique offering of experiential learning. She is passionate about teaching skills that enhance deep intimacy, lasting attraction, and give each participant the tools for full embodiment and capacity. Michaela also traveled and co-taught with David Deida for 13 years. Michaela teaches women's workshops, intimacy intensives for men and women, as well as offers mentorships and relationship counseling. She lives and teaches on a small organic farm in Ojai, California, where her land and animals inspire her clients to reconnect intimately with themselves and others. So welcome, Michaela.
oh, thank you.
I love your bio. You've got a lot going on here.
I do. It seems.
And it doesn't mention that you travel. It does. You travel all around the world.
Yes, this year particularly, I've been on the road for 4.5 months already,
Yeah.
and I'm about to go on another 3-month run.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. You're
Yeah.
in demand.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of fun,
Yeah.
I must say.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. So, my podcast is the Empowered Living with Ann O'Brien podcast. I have the Empowered Life program. And so I want to just check in and see what comes to mind for you when you think about empowerment when it comes to sexuality.
Oh, wow. Let's jump right in.
Yeah.
I think as far as empowerment and sexuality, for me, the most important thing is that people are free from the constrictions that they themselves or others have imposed on them. And what that looks like, I'm not really that bothered by, right? That could look any which way. But what it feels like is a certain kind of a relaxation and freedom around one's desires and actions and expressions, because they're not clenched under self-imposed or externally imposed, circumstances.
Beautiful. And I think most of our culture is clenched under superimposed circumstances when it comes to their sexuality. I mean, it's the shadow. It's been, sort of either glorified or repressed for so many.
Yeah.
That's important work.
Yeah. And, it's... I don't know exactly how to say it, because it's not I look at sexual empowerment not in the classic sense of you can do whatever the hell you want.
Exactly.
I look at it as in you are free to choose. You're not slave to some suppressed kinks or cravings.
Yes.
Which is equally as important as being free of, societal influences.
Wow. And how do you get there?
Well, that's a very individual process, I would say, but I would definitely always suggest that people have certain processes in place, just very simple psychotherapeutic processes where they're clear before they go into the more tantric or yogic or however sacred sexuality aspects. It's always good to get clear where are the areas of real suppression or perversion or kink or whatever you want to call it, so that you're not blind to your shadow, essentially.
Yeah, I listened to your podcast with Michael Ellsberg, and you talked a lot about that. People going into these sacred sexuality groups and they haven't really done their work, and so it can just be another way to play out these tendencies. Would you say?
Yes, definitely, because if it's not examined, it will just repeat itself over and over in different kind of configurations, right? And the configurations are usually, uh, unexamined things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love the idea of, at the same time, of bringing spirituality to sexuality. And we hear a lot, like in spiritual circles, about we're all one. And yet I know you've talked about the sexual tension that grows through our polarity. So how do we combine sexuality and spirituality?
Well, I think the problem is not combining it. The problem is conflating it, because one has nothing to do with the other.
That's funny.
In a certain way, oneness isn't. Um, let's say it this way: you feeling one, or you having an experience of oneness, is an experience of you being part of everything that's arising, including somebody else, including the bed you sit on, or the person you speak to. And that feeling of oneness, or that falling into, everything, or experiencing everything. Some people call it emptiness. Some people call it fullness.
Yeah.
That's you could say a spiritual experience, but that's the experience of having taken yourself a bit out of the equation. Now, in sexuality, of course, you are taking yourself very much in there, because when you meet with another human, the first things that happen, of course, is that you have preferences, and you have, a certain type, or a certain desire for something, or however you would want to say it. Your personality and your persona, and if you want to say your ego, for the sake of the spiritual description,
Sure.
is very much in play in a certain way. So, but that has nothing to do with polarity. That's a separate issue, right? So, how much of you is in a relational interaction, or how much of you in general is in your world interaction? That depends on many different things, and people think that it's more evolved to be one at all times.
Yeah.
And you could say that from a spiritual standpoint, but that's also kind of a bit of a consumerism. You are where you are anyway, and trying to achieve these states is probably keeping you from actually experiencing these states. It's the doing that gets you, out of the being. And so a lot of spiritual practice, in parentheses, is geared towards getting somewhere, when really the people who have experienced great states of oneness, it's usually not in a moment of striving for that state of oneness. So now the same is true, of course, in polarity, or in relational interaction. The more you try, the less the less it will go well.
I've certainly seen that in my clients. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, because most people come to a coach or a therapist or a tantra teacher or a healer trying to get somewhere, and often the very act of pushing so hard is what keeps them also from being open and relaxed, and with it in a way that they can even be in relationship.
For sure.
And so that's one conversation, right? And then the polarity conversation is a different conversation, because polarity is just a mechanism of attraction, or not attraction, right? And that mechanism can be used regardless if you feel oneness or not. You can always split into two, artificially split into two to experience that polarity. Now, that also happens internally, right? In all the great alchemical traditions, shamanic, yogic traditions, they talk about the internal marriage, so to speak, right? The masculine and the feminine internally having a tension and the tussle and the play, which is what keeps us alive and creative and full. So it doesn't matter if you play out the polarity internally or with another human, but there can't be any there can't be oneness without polarity, like there can't be dark without light.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I remember once I knew a man who was he was a former heroin addict, and then he got addicted to meditating 5 hours a day, and he claimed he wasn't bothered by anything anymore. He's very proud. He's very smug. He's like, I don't get upset anymore. And I was like, oh my God, I want to run away from you. I don't trust you. Because I could tell, it was this, putting spirit, what's the word? Like,
a spiritual bypass.
Yeah. Replacing the addiction. I was like,
yeah. Yeah, it's certainly not about not getting upset anymore.
Yeah.
It is very useful if you can pull apart your reaction from what's happening.
Yes.
That's very useful.
Yes.
But certainly not feeling anything isn't very spiritual.
Right, because we are human and we are embodies, and I know that's a big part of your work is embodiment.
Yeah, very, very big part of my work, is embodiment.
I don't know if you remember, but when I went to your workshop, I'm sure you don't know, you've worked with many, many people since then, but one thing you told me, we were doing these exercises where you had us act, I don't know if it was dancing or more of a theatrical thing, we were just expressing different parts, and you said, Anne, bring out more anger. And that's been actually very helpful for me. And I know I work with my clients a lot about, having their full range of feelings, their full range of all that they are. Do you want to talk about this and why this is important, whether, for our embodiment, for our sexuality, our fullness?
Yeah, but the bringing out more anger is, of course, just an exploration into allowing yourself to feel everything. Mm-hmm. So, because all these things are always there. Like within you, there's always masculine and feminine. It's just, what are you using?
Yeah.
The same way all emotions are present at all times when appropriate and are felt. Mm-hmm. And the way it usually goes in human development is that we realize at some point that certain emotions are less favored than others. Yeah. And in order to conform, not conform as in societally conform, but conform in the ways that maximum love is achieved, so to speak, because that's what we're kind of after. We are then, adjusting our input and our output, meaning we don't allow ourselves to feel that much because it's kind of painful. And we're also not allowing ourselves to express that much because it might be inappropriate. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times these things are inappropriate, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're in a meeting situation, you do not necessarily want to bring out your anger, but that externally, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to feel it internally.
Yes.
And appropriately measure what's happening next by the feelings you are experiencing or the sensations you're experiencing. Mm. And so in women's workshops particularly, because it's a big issue in women, and we can talk about why it's a different. So it's not that it's not an issue in men, but it has a different repercussion in women. When women have not allowed themselves to feel and or express, one comes after the other, of course, certain emotions like sadness, like anger, like rage, like wrath, they're also not able to feel the more pleasurable sensations, because you can only feel as much orgasmic pleasure as you can feel anger.
Yes.
The band has to widen on both ends of the spectrum. And so often there isn't a lot of feeling all around because the feeling's been so clenched down. Yeah. And that has a few effects, one of which is if you can feel what's happening with you, you have no intimacy with yourself, which of course means you can't have any intimacy with anyone else. Because if you can't feel yourself, how in the world are you going to feel someone else? Yeah. Not very likely, or not very accurately, which we see a lot, right? The inaccurate sensations then, because you can feel properly yourself. And so that's one aspect. And of course the other aspect is the becoming aware of feelings allows you to respond appropriately. So one of the big pitfalls in relationship is that often people are not capable of feeling what's actually happening in the moment, and it takes them forever. And then they come out with this stuff, a day later or 3 hours later, when the moment has passed and the expression of that particular feeling is useless. Right?
Yeah. And won't get them a very good response with their partner if that's
exactly
the case. Yeah.
Because if you and I talk and then you say something and I don't realize that that was extremely upsetting to me, and then 3 hours later we're having a cup of tea and suddenly I scream at you, you'll just think I'm insane in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, it's going to cause a huge upset.
Yeah.
For the both of us. And so the fluid understanding and feeling of your emotions is what allows for that, to happen. And then, of course, the fluid expression of everything that's happening allows the body to stay current with what you're feeling, and it allows your body to stay responsive with what you're feeling. And that's both good for proper boundary setting, for instance, and for pleasure.
Yeah. Wow. So much you just said in the last 2 minutes. I want to just take a big spotlight on it. So helpful. And so one thing I'm hearing is that it's not always appropriate in the moment to express, and yet we need to feel it fully in the moment, because if we hold it, it causes, I'm not going to say everything you just said, but it causes a lot of problems if you hold it, but you need to really feel it. I'm just thinking, if it's not appropriate in the moment, what does that look like for somebody to feel it, but maybe don't express it at the meeting, but still have that conversation or have that emotion move? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as clear cut as feel it and don't express it, because of course, if you feel it fully, it's going to want to express itself, right?
Right.
So when anger rises through you, of course you want to strike out, right? That's what anger does.
Yeah.
So the important piece is to allow the anger to flow and not clench down on it.
Yeah.
But also not act.
All
right?
Yeah.
And just allow it to flow. And then usually what happens with most emotions, when they're allowed to flow, they go away pretty quickly.
Yes.
Right? Because the only way something stays if you clench down on it and you kind of let it fester, or you even nurture it, right? You fan the flame in the back of your mind while you're sitting there smiling, and then it comes out, of course, in some really wild way.
Yeah.
And so that's the the very, very important pieces, that you have enough wherewithal in your body that you can feel things, but that you are not reacting crazily about it. And that takes a bit of practice, but it's totally doable when you are in tune with your body.
I liked what you said too about it helps with proper boundary setting, because I've worked as a psychic and a clairvoyant, and people come to me, well, how do I put up healthy boundaries? And it's like, it's not about putting up a wall. It's really about letting your feelings tell you what's appropriate for you or not. What do you think about that?
I think that's very true. I mean, you can't, in that domain, you can't set, have an absolute. You have to feel what's actually happening, so that you can make a decision based on what's happening and not your either projection of what's happening or your delayed reaction to what's happening. And that requires a certain kind of fluidity. And it certainly helps, as I said in the very beginning, with the empowered sexuality. It certainly helps when you know your personal trigger points, your personal moments where you get a bit, more into your triggers than other times. And when you know those things and when they're somewhat examined, then you can also calibrate the boundary setting better. And most importantly, right, when you know what is happening within you, then you can make a proper decision around the boundary, because it's not delayed.
Yeah. I would love if you have an example to give us, maybe about somebody you worked with and they, discovered their trigger, and what did that look like to have that awareness and work with it? If you'd like.
Well, nothing comes to mind,
Okay.
when you ask me like that. But I'm trying to come up with an example that that would make sense. So just bear with me for a second. Well, I'll give you a recent example out of my own, because it's much easier, to narrate this.
Sure.
So I sat with someone the other day in a counseling situation, meaning in a professional situation, so it wasn't personal. And I heard something that to me was unacceptable. One of the few things that when I hear certain things, that people do, there's very, very few things that I find unacceptable. And this particular person reported something that in my book is a no-go, right? And so I could feel in that moment everything in me starting to rise. And I was, what I wanted to do was get up and just say, okay, you know what, our session's over and you are fired.
Whoa.
And I will never, go away. And that impulse was very strong. And so I sat there and I let that impulse just burn through me. And these things happen in split seconds, but I could see myself get up and I could see myself leave. And I went through the whole thing internally, but I knew that I was massively triggered. Because I know this is something that I'm just not good with. And most people wouldn't be good with, but that's neither here nor there. Right? I wasn't good with it, and I knew I was triggered, and I could feel from knowing what triggered feels like in my body that essentially everything shuts down. And I was done, and I just wanted to get out of there. And on the way out, ideally attack, but I know better than that because I've been doing this for many, many, many years, right? But so I waited and I waited and I waited, and I did absolutely nothing till the trigger had passed. And only when the trigger had passed and I could breathe properly, my hands weren't trembling, I wasn't seeing red, did I then ask my client more specifically about that?
Yeah.
And and I said at that point, that to me that's something I can be working with. And in that particular moment, my client then could say, but it was only when I could say it without having to run out of the room. And it was very clear cut, so it didn't need to be explained why that was unacceptable. And because I didn't go for him or left in the middle of being triggered, he then could say, yeah, I know that was pretty bad and this will never happen again and I need help with it. And then, appropriate steps could be taken. And that would have not happened if I would let my conviction and my trigger run the show.
Wow.
Now, do I want to be around this particular situation in the future? No, probably not. But I didn't let my own stuff get in the way, even though it was very, very extreme, of this person who entrusted me with their care, so to speak, being dropped because of an action that they were reporting. And to begin with, the action was reported with kind of a, fuck you, this is what I do kind of attitude.
Ooh.
And because I didn't do what classically has been done in that case, there could be a solution.
Wow. You're a powerful space holder.
Well, that's a bit, it's a bit vague of an explanation, simply because I don't want to give any details away.
Of course.
But that's always an option. It's not that easy, and it's certainly not that easy in a relationship, because of course in a relationship, there's less of a container. You're not in a client-patient relationship. You didn't get paid to sit there, and things like that. But the if nothing else, acquiring the discipline to wait till the worst has passed is very, very useful.
Yes, I love that story. And my partner and I have a process where we've both had a spiritual practice since we were teenagers, and so we have a lot of self-awareness. And when we get triggered, we know to step away, or we know, as much as possible to go and do what we need to do, whether it's chant or meditate or go for a walk or whatever, to shift our energy and then come back to it. But it takes a long time to get there. I think for most people, it's not always easy.
No, it isn't. On the contrary, it's very, very hard, and most people cannot step away or separate out or things like that.
Yeah.
And it's hard enough to do that. But if you don't have fluidity with your sensations and you're not familiar with what's actually happening in your body, you have no chance whatsoever.
Yeah. So on that note, we'll let y'all go and figure it out. So a lot of what you do, Michaela, is bring people into their body, in your workshops.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that bringing people into their body is the prerequisite for a lot of the things that I deal with, simply because I deal with the relational, sexual aspects of living and the feeling and being sensitive to feeling, in the context of relationship to life, relationship to another human, relationship to oneself. And so being able to feel the body is very important. Embodiment, as my co-teacher Steve always points out, right, is kind of a wrong word, because when are you ever not in your body?
Right.
It's not that you're not in your body. It's just that you have no proper signals from your body, and your body is essentially doing what your body does, and you are not connected with that body.
Yes.
But your body is always doing what your body is doing. It's just, if you're not with your body, if you're in your head, or if you're hyper emotional, your body signals can't be interpreted or even heard properly. And then you have everything from, a proneness to injure yourself in the extreme cases of being disembodied, or not being able to make proper decisions, or being taken hostage by your feelings. All of these things happen when you are not fully connected with your body. So embodiment, or resensitizing to your body, which is a more appropriate way of putting it, is essentially the key for most other practices, and therefore it has to be attended to. And then when we talk a little bit more about the more sexual domain, I've started last year already, and we're doing more this year, and the next year will be a big focus on that. Started teaching actual intimate yogic arts, sexual yoga, how energy moves through the body, where it comes from, where it goes, how do you use it, how do you work with another human's body in energy, specifically in the sexual domain. If you're not sensitive to what's happening in your body, you don't have a chance of figuring out what's happening in another human's body.
For sure.
Because the way we feel what's happening in someone else's, we actually feel the resonance of that in your own body.
Wow. Can you give an example of some of these exercises in sexuality, intimacy, some of those practices?
Well, the embodiment practices are, without going into detail about the exercises, but the embodiment practices are always about movement of the body, of course, right? And movement of the body with a particular attention towards becoming aware of what's happening in the body. So you can use movement to kind of numb yourself to feeling, or you can use movement to increase feeling. So all embodiment practices deal with moving the body and feeling your body's needs and reactions much more acutely. And then from there, once you're able to feel your body and your body's reactions, you can learn quite quickly to feel another human with your own body. And then, of course, from there, you can learn to touch. You can learn to touch sexually. You can learn to speak. You can learn to move. You can learn how a person, to become sensitive to how a person reacts to your touch, reacts to your speech, reacts to you moving. And then you learn, through that, you can learn how to calibrate the offering that you give so that it can be received.
Yeah. And sometimes it's surprising. Like, we think we're touching in a way that would get a certain response, and it just doesn't. It's like, wait a minute. So it's really good to have feedback.
Exactly. Because, of course, we touch other people the way we want to be touched.
Yeah.
And not how they want to be touched.
Right. That's another thing. Yeah. My man will tell me verbatim, touch me like this, but not all not all people do that with their partner.
Exactly. Exactly. And so you see that all the time in workshops where you ask one partner to touch the other, and they touch them exactly the way they want to be touched.
Yeah.
And then they can't understand why there isn't the response that they are hoping for. Yeah. But they can't feel what's really happening with the other person because they're somewhat serving themselves in the way they touch, and they just feel themselves in the touch that they're giving the other. And so with becoming aware of your body and the other person's body, you can begin to feel what that body needs versus what your body needs.
Yeah. I want to circle back a little bit to this whole empowerment idea, because I have the idea when I wrote the question to you, or when I asked you, I can imagine some, particularly women, might take that question, like you said, well, it's not about doing whatever you want, nor is it for, women in particular. Well, I'm a strong woman and I'm a, sex magnet too, and they go get it and they wonder why it doesn't happen.
Right.
You said something like that. So I want to speak, because I work with a lot of those women, and I'm guessing some of those women too, right? Does this make sense where I'm going?
Yeah, but ask the question, then we can go to.
Yeah, well, what would you say? I mean, I'm just also thinking, you just reminded me when you're talking about these partner exercises, because I remember at the David Data workshop where I initially met you, we were doing these exercises, and it was like the guy raises his hand when he feels that your heart is open to him or something like that. And I thought I was like fully, lit up, and he's like, nah. And I think I was just too much of like, I'm a bright, successful, not that I was trying to project my success in the world, but, like, here I am, I'm shining strong, but I wasn't soft, and I wasn't as much in my heart. And I know a lot of women are just like, go get them all day long. And then they wonder why they're not attracting the man. Does this make sense?
It does. But there's two things to consider here. The first thing is that in an exercise like this, and that's why these exercises have a limited usefulness.
Okay.
In an exercise like this, you are dealing with the other person's projections more than anything else.
True.
Right. And so one of the reasons those exercises have limited value is that when the person cannot accurately feel themselves, they're just sitting there, and it's like, okay, well, give her a number for how open her heart is. How would he know how to measure that? Well, he can only measure that by feeling whatever he's feeling.
Yeah.
So if his feeling range hasn't been properly trained, that's a fairly limited feeling capacity.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that that's not a valuable thing to explore, because other people can feel you often much more accurately than you can feel yourself, as evidenced by you're angry. I'm not angry,
Right.
But what's more important is that the heart openness is, when we talk about empowerment, for instance, right, that the heart openness or the sexual openness or the openness in general is commensurate with what's going on. Because one of the real issues that I've encountered out there in the worlds of that kind of practice is that it's somehow assumed that an open heart is better than a closed heart.
I love that.
And that you're supposed to keep your heart open no matter what. Those are the big misconceptions out there, right? Oh, love regardless. Keep your heart open regardless. Well, if that's not grounded in something, that's just martyrdom. That's just stupid, really, right? Because once again, there can't be darkness without light. There can't be oneness without polarity. There can't be openness without closedness. And there's very few people whose hearts are always open.
Yeah.
And those people whose hearts are always open are often, they have these massively pained expressions on their faces because they feel everything, right? And it doesn't collapse them, and there's a natural opening and closing of the heart, not only in the way it's pumping, but in the way it's loving, that is required to feel the contrast. Now, can you have an open baseline? Yes, and every human being has that. If you've ever looked into a baby's eyes, you see that openness. But can and should your heart close at times? For the sake of self-preservation, for the sake of contrast, for the sake of appropriate feedback? Absolutely. And, to kind of make yourself open your heart, no matter what's going on across from there, isn't that useful? Mm-hmm. Because that might not be the appropriate thing. Now you sit with a guy, where this is just that example that you mentioned. You sit with a guy and he's just, I don't know, maybe he's just lecherous at that particular moment, right? He's looking at your heart, aka your breasts, and and you feel like his need in the interaction. Well, you can have compassion, absolutely. You can soften your heart away from the curl of ew, but you're not going to just open yourself up to more of that.
Yeah.
And that's what people often conflate. It's perfectly fine to have compassion and understanding and a softness towards somebody, but that doesn't mean that you have to just be wide open and get walked on or transgressed upon.
Right.
You can be loving, but keep a certain kind of a no going. One of the exercises I teach consistently in workshops is how do you say no with a relatively open heart? How do you say no without closing yourself off and shutting it all down? How do you have compassion and love in your interaction and still say no?
Yeah.
Right? Because opening your heart and giving it all over are not the same things. Mm. So that said, right, now we come to the I'm a strong, independent woman.
Yeah.
Right? That has really nothing to do with the heart per se, because you can be a strong, independent woman, have a very closed heart, so to speak, meaning not allow yourself to feel anything. You can be a strong, independent woman and be very compassionate and empathetic and deeply feeling. The strong, independent woman is a completely different set of circumstances to consider, which is your willingness to, let's say, cooperate or surrender or collaborate, which is kind of more in the realm of how much do you allow another person to contribute to you? Or you could say, how much do you allow another person to penetrate you? Mm-hmm. So in the male-female interaction, or in the, how it's often said, masculine-feminine interaction, which is not entirely true, because when you are with a man and you are animating your feminine, your masculine is still there in the act, right? It doesn't go away.
Yeah.
You're not you're not 100% feminine. You're just choosing to animate that part of your being for the sake of the polarity, for the sake of the sexual play. And he is choosing to animate more of that side of the spectrum for the sexual play. But of course, he will still have his feminine aspects at play, because he will need them to be able to feel you and play with you, right? And you need your masculine aspects, because otherwise you'd be, spineless and wouldn't know what the hell's happening to you. Mm-hmm. And of course, in a good sexual interaction, you have moments where it feels like one person is like 100% masculine, 100% feminine. But for the most part, it's a constant play on the spectrum. And so the act of surrender, sexually speaking, requires, of course, or the act of being penetrated requires that there's an opening. Mm-hmm. Not only genitally, but also emotionally, energetically, psychically, however you would want to call it. So when you don't have an opening, when you don't have a hole, so there is nowhere to stick it in. So, right. So to say this very crudely, so when you are a strong, independent woman, often we have trained ourselves for that to mean that we're quite self-contained, and that self-containment is kind of it's an armor or a shell or a muscular contraction that allows us to keep our energy in ourselves and use them to propel ourselves forward. And that particular energetics has a physical equivalent, which is a certain kind of a tension in the midline of the body, a certain kind of a hardness that comes from bringing the energy in and moving it upward. Technically speaking, that's what it looks like. And you see that, and you can feel that when you get up, for instance, right? You gather your energy and then you rise. And that same kind of gather and rise applies to doing stuff. And because of the way a woman's body is built, this is regardless of if she decides to play in the masculine or the feminine, by the way, which are, at this point, kind of arbitrary terms. But regardless of what your disposition is, whenever you do something and you do it for yourself, it requires that you harness your own energy for your own sake. And that muscular pattern and that kind of disposition makes you a closed circuit. And so then, of course, now you're on a date, and all day you have diligently kept your circuits closed. And now you would like this man to penetrate you, so to speak, not maybe genitally, but with his direction, with his ideas, with the way he talks to you. But habitually, you're not capable of making an opening. Yeah. And then that's what happens with the I'm a strong, independent woman, right? Even if you have the desire to lay that down for the sake of the sexual relational aspect, if you don't have muscular facility and emotional ability to create a whole, so to speak, it's not going to go very well.
Yeah. I talk to these women, they so want to be ravished, and yet they don't realize that they are not in a space of receiving. So I love what you shared. I would love if you tell us about your workshops. I know you have a lot of workshops coming up, and I'm hoping to see you in LA this fall, but I know you'll be around the world. Would you like to share where people can come and do some of this work with you?
Yeah. My home base, of course, is north of LA in Ojai. And this fall, there's a few offerings. There is an intro evening in LA in November, on November 8th to be exact. So that's a really nice, good intro. If you've never done anything with me or never done anything like this, that will give you a bit of an entry into how do you counteract your patterns around closing off or holding people at bay. How do you connect? How do you play with those energies? So that's a very good one.
And that's co-ed, correct?
Yes, that's men and women, and you practice that kind of intimate, polarized interaction. I'm also doing one of those for a whole weekend at Esselen in October. So every year I do 7 days at Esselen. 5 days is just for women, and that's an amazing immersion
Yeah.
where you get to play with how do you get out of your habitual self-containment in the body. How does your body express itself when it's free and happy and pleasurable? How do you feel pleasure in the body, and so on and so on. So that's end of October at Esselen. Then I'm doing a weekend that's called the Yoga of Deep Intimacy, where it's men and women, where we go more into that. I also have like a special instruction series starting on November 12th, which is more of the sexual yoga, the sexual intimate tantric arts, where you learn how to touch another human, feel another human, speak with another human, all of those kind of things. And then there is the 5-month men's and women's study groups, and teacher training this year as well. So there's lots and lots and lots going on.
Yeah.
Which is such a pleasure. And it can all be found on my website. I'm also in Europe twice this fall. Canada, I'm going to be in Vancouver for an evening talk and a weekend that's also men and women jointly. Australia. So it's a very, very full few months now.
Awesome. And her website, for those of you that would like to check it out, is Michaela Boehm, MichaelaBoehm.com. You can look at the workshops page for different workshops, and I'm going to post that below the podcast as well.
Yeah, that would be great. And then the other thing I wanted to say, and that's always a good resource for people who are too far away to come and actually meet. I have a SoundCloud page that can be accessed from my homepage that has probably about 50 hours of free audio on it, all kinds of interviews and podcasts and question and answer sessions. And so that's a nice resource if somebody wants to just hear a bit more. There's some on specific topics, some on women's areas, men's areas. So that's always fun. And that's from my homepage. There's this link on my homepage.
Excellent. Oh, Michaela, this is such important work. I'm really glad you're doing it. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Well, thank you.